state of Texas. Appreciate you. My name is Mordecai Dixon. I work for the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center located at the Steve Hicks School of Social Work and under the header of the Texas Institute of Excellence in Mental Health. It's my honor to be with you today. We will be addressing a really important topic. We're very excited to have this presentation. We've been waiting a long while to get Dr. Sarah Kate Bierman into this space. And so we're glad to have her once again. She's done incredible work for us before. Before we get going today, I do want to address a little bit about who we are for those who may not know what the MHTTC is or does. Tell you a little bit about what's going to happen in the course of the day. And then also let you know about what happens afterward. Real quickly, so let's take a look at some housekeeping. So today, our presentation was designed to be secure. If for some reason we are unexpectedly shut down, we will let you know through the registration process, the same one that you used to come onto this program today, what will take place next. We don't anticipate any difficulties, but we do want to make sure that you have a heads up in advance. If you have any comments, you want to share ideas today, the chat functions are in place. We are doing everything in our power to make sure that we can get Q&As addressed. But as you are seeing, there's a number of you in here today. So we want to make sure that there are voices are heard, as well as opportunities for those voices to be addressed. Can't promise that we'll get to every question, but we'll make every effort to, even if that means doing some follow-up after the presentation. Those of you who are using this learning moment for CEUs, this is the way this will work. CEUs are attached to your registration. So if you're sitting in a room with 4 other people right now, only one of those persons is going to get these 4 CEU credits. Being fully present for the program is just that. Out of respect to the presenter as well as to ourselves, we want to make sure that we're fully present as much as we possibly can be today. Being off camera is almost a thing anymore, but for this presentation and because of some of the interactive work that will take place during the day, we want to ask and encourage you to challenge by choice, allow yourself to have some of this learning that's taking place today and be on screen as well as actively participating. We will process those CEUs about a week after the presentation. So we get all of the administrative stuff taken care of, and then we actually make sure that CEUs are processed, and you'll get that information as well as those CEU credits through email as well, through your registration information. Please make sure that the CEUs are aligned with your particular licensing requirements and things of that nature. Be mindful that certain portions of this program will be recorded. And out of respect to some of our clients, some of Dr. Sarah Kate's clients, we will take pauses and not record certain sections of this. The MHTTC creates an environment in our learning spaces. And so today we want to really make sure that we live some of the values that you see before you right now. We're using language. For us, language is really important, especially in the day that we live in. We want hope and strength-based conversations based into our programming, inclusive discussions, and being accepting, even if I don't fully understand, diverse culture, genders, perspectives, just being as person-centered as we can in the way that we talk about the experience of the work and the people who are impacted by the work, including ourselves. So we want to think of this work today in a healing headset, a trauma responsive headset, being respectable and clear, as well as being consistent. What do I do with this? What do I do? How do I take this to the next level and build it into the work that I go back to do day in and day out? We, again, in essence, are going to treat each other the way we want to be treated, with human dignity and respect and kindness. And so with that in mind, all intersectionality is welcomed in this space. All of it has value in this space. And we're glad that we have people who work with us and who who embody the characteristics I just mentioned. Ultimately, safety is important, all types of safety, and we want to make sure that that is paramount in our session for today. If you didn't know, the MHTTC is not just based in Texas. Our region is Region 6. That is the area down in the purple part of the map, but MHTTCs are national. They're networks of dissemination and implementation, taking evidence-based practices and building them into educational programming so that folks like you can do the work that you do day in and day out, more informed than you are before you came in. It's our hope that we can reach as many folks as possible, and then in turn, you would reach as many as possible. If you look around, our catchment is the area of New Mexico, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Arkansas, including Texas. Enough of that. The reason you're here today is to hear from Dr. Sarah Kate Bierman. I'll tell you a little bit about her. Dr. Bierman's research focuses on the dissemination and implementation of empirically supported practices for underserved youth in community settings. And her research examines the processes and contexts that promote and support the effective use and sustainability of ESPs, with particular focus on treatment, redesign, training, and supervision, and the use of non-traditional providers and settings to increase ESP access. Dr. Bierman also has many years of experience in the development, testing, and dissemination of effective treatments for youth. She provides both clinical supervision and national trainings for therapists in the use of empirically supported practices for anxiety, depression, disruptive conduct, and traumatic stress. So without further ado, I introduce Dr. Sarah Kate Bierman. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Just take a second.
I'm going to stop share.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully you guys are seeing my burnt orange slides now. All right. So I'm so happy to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation to speak. And it's so exciting to have people from so many different places and different settings. Looking forward to hearing a little bit about where each of you are working and the kinds of children and families that you're serving. As was just eloquently said, I'm Sarah Kate Bierman. I'm a clinical child psychologist by training. I'm an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and I direct the LEAP lab, which is leveraging evidence and advancing practice for youth mental health. And you already heard all the things that I research, but really thinking about how to take practices that have been supported by science and bring them into the settings where kids and families are really being served. So schools, mental health clinics, child welfare, pediatric primary care, that's my passion. So just to tell you a little bit about what we're going to do, because you guys are going to be with me for a while, we will have 2 10-minute breaks. So during those breaks, feel free to just stay logged in and just turn your camera off and mute yourself. And there will be specific Q&A periods. You're welcome to chat in questions, I think, at any time, and we'll try to monitor that. But if you want to unmute yourself during Q&A periods, that would be great. And I won't pause to respond to the chat until we get to those breaks. As was stated, it'd be great if people can leave their cameras on. I know not everyone can for privacy reasons, but it is so much nicer for me when I'm speaking to see your faces, know if, you know, what I'm saying is hitting. I'm always looking for smiles and nods and that. And then also, you're going to have some interactive stuff today. So if anyone is just kind of sitting back on mute with their video off and doing other things, there might be some moments where we actually are asking you to interact with one of your colleagues. So please don't do that. So to keep things interesting, because we're online and, you know, online has a lot of good things about it, but it's not as, you know, personal, exciting, sometimes not as engaging as in person. So I have a few different technologies that I like to use. to kind of keep things interesting and so that you guys can all participate, even though we are online. So the first thing is we're going to be using some polls. So as you can see, you can text me. You can join on the web, and I'll put the URL into the chat. Or if you take a picture of the QR code, I'll see someone already figured it out. You can answer these. And once you're in, you don't have to get in again. You can stay in my polls. So curious to know how you prefer to attend clinical workshops. What's your preference? And thanks to you all who are responding. I like to see it. It's early in the morning to learn new technology, so. Okay, well, it looks like, and please keep answering. Nobody is saying that they don't want to attend any clinical workshop, so that's a relief. And it looks like, most people, a little majority are preferring online, but some of you are definitely missing those in-person interactions, which I totally agree with. There's nothing can replace, just creative people who all care about the same things being in the room together. So we'll do our best to make it seem like that. Okay, so you guys got the polls. We're also going to be using breakout rooms. So breakout rooms can be tricky. Time, we don't have the length of, we may not have long sessions, or we may not have as many sessions with kids as maybe in some other settings. So we really want to make the best use of the time that we do have. I'm going to touch briefly on some special cases, panic and GAD, and then lastly, talk about exposure in schools and other complex settings. So that's my plan. I hope we get through it all. I have a lot planned, and away we go. So first, we're going to talk about the biopsychosocial model of anxiety. This might be familiar to some of you. But basically, first, I want to make sure we're all kind of on the same page with our terms. So fear is an emotional response that's elicited in the presence of a specific threatening situation, right? If a dog attacks you, you're going to feel fear. And fear is very adaptive because fear helps us to get out of bad situations. It sends a surge of energy through our bodies and gives us extra, strength, speed, etc., that we may need in those moments. Anxiety is an emotional response elicited about possible future threatening events, like expecting to be attacked by a dog. And that can occur in the absence of danger or threat. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. And then panic, because people use panic a lot colloquially. People will say, oh, I had a panic attack today, but they really just mean they felt anxious. Panic, when I talk about it, I'm talking about a group of physical symptoms of the fight-flight response that come on very quickly, all at once, in the absence of any obvious danger or threat. So that's just a little vocab. So when I'm talking about anxiety, I'm talking about three interrelated systems. So there's our cognitive system, our brain, our thinking. And when it comes to anxiety, there's a neural network, and I'm going to talk more about this, that has information about the stimuli or the situation that gets activated in the presence of that situation, or even in the presence of things that remind us of that situation. And that can lead to difficulty concentrating, feelings of apprehension. The brain sends messages to our physical system. So that's our sympathetic nervous system, which is going to elicit all the bodily sensations of fight, flight, or freeze. And so, you can think about what are the things that your body does to prepare to run. Your heart starts pounding. You might start breathing more rapidly, right? And that's really helpful if you have to run. We will be giving you guys copies of the slides. But it's not so helpful if you're actually about to give a speech or, walk into a party. And then there's the behavioral system, which reacts to the threatening situation. And these actions are actually pretty consistently, we see fight, flight, and freeze mostly flight, right? So when people feel anxious, they mostly try to get out of the situation. They mostly try to escape or avoid the situation. Sometimes they stay in the situation, but are really kind of frozen. You might think about kids who are super anxious, can't leave the classroom, but when they get called on, their minds go blank. That would be like a freeze response. And then some people get like a surge of aggression, actually, when they feel anxious, which is their body preparing to fight. And so, if you're working with kids, you know already that anxious kids and non-compliant kids are not two separate groups of kids. Actually, like 60% of kids with anxiety disorders also have co-occurring oppositional defiant disorder and other disruptive behavior disorders. So that this might be those kids, right? Where in a moment where they feel anxious, their kind of first impulse is to fight back or tantrum or refuse. So I said before that our anxiety system, our fear system is adaptive, and it's true. It's there to keep us safe, right? So this is the biopsychosocial model of anxiety that I talked about before, which says that in the presence of a stimulus, and I'm going to use the word stimulus a lot today, and all I mean there is a fear source, right? Like something that makes you feel worried or scared. Our brain makes an accurate interpretation of threat, and we think to ourselves, this is not good. I'm in danger. And that sets off our body alarm, which is this anxious arousal. And it's truly arousal. It's our sympathetic nervous system kind of taking off, getting ready to fight, flight, freeze. And that's the behavior that we see. So when following anxious arousal, we usually engage in one of those behaviors, either fighting back, leaving the situation, or freezing. So that's very adaptive. For example, it's a big problem in Austin. I don't know if where y'all are, if it's also a thing, but we have a huge coyote population here in Austin, Texas. And if I'm walking on, the nature trail and I encounter one of these guys, it's probably pretty adaptive of me to engage in this, right? Actually, what you're supposed to do with coyotes is make yourself really big and like throw rocks at over, not to hurt them, but just to scare them away, right? So that would be like a fight response. And that would be smart. That would be a good thing to do. Anxiety becomes problematic when there's a stimulus that we misinterpret as threatening. Okay. So instead of accurately perceiving something as safe, we either overestimate how likely something bad is to happen, or we underestimate our ability to handle whatever happens. And what's interesting is, even though it's a misinterpretation of threat, our body can't tell the difference. So when the brain sends a message saying danger, 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 the same fight, flight, freeze response gets kicked off. So it's good to have that reaction here, but it's not great to have it just when I'm walking where there might be coyotes, right? If I'm feeling that fight, flight, freeze the whole time I'm on the trail because I might see a coyote. It's definitely not great if I go to the Nature and Science Center where they have a coyote like in a cage that I can see, not a cage, like in an enclosed area. And it would be really bad if it's so intense that I can't even watch Looney Tunes because of Wile E. Coyote, right? So that's an example of how anxiety can be helpful, but can also kind of go wrong and make us afraid of things that we're actually have no real threat of. We don't need to be scared. So what that looks like is we experience a fear stimulus. We misinterpret the threat, again, either overestimating that something bad will happen, overestimating how bad it'll be if it does happen, and underestimating our ability to handle it. Then I feel anxious and I start to have all that physical arousal. I don't like the way that feels. That feels terrible. So I get myself out of the situation, and we call that avoidant coping. So that's me saying, no, I don't want to go on a walk on the trail when I'm invited. That's me walking around the, getting away from the enclosure where the coyote is at the zoo. That's me turning the channel when Wile E. Coyote comes on. And then when I do avoid, I actually feel a lot better, right? That turns my anxiety system off. So it's very reinforcing to avoid scary things. But what also happens is I never learn. And that's what absence of corrective experience means. I never learn. I never learn I would be okay. I never learned that, yeah, I can walk on the trail and no coyote is going to come near me. And because I never have that experience to learn, I continue to misinterpret the threat. So this works with pretty much all of the different anxiety disorders you could think of. Here's an example of what this might look like with separation anxiety disorder. Parent goes out for the night, kid thinks something bad's going to happen to me if I'm not with my mom. They feel sick to their stomach, their heart's racing, their muscles are tense. They cry as soon as the sitter arrives. They keep crying. Eventually they get themselves so worked up that they throw up. The sitter calls mom, parents come home, kid feels better immediately. Anxiety decreases. They think I'm safe, but only because my mom came home, right? Their behavior of crying and trying to avoid and get out of having a babysitter is reinforced. That means it's more likely to happen again because they felt so much better. And again, they think they only survived because their parents returned. So that's what that would look like. That's how it is developed and maintained in separation anxiety. Here's a good example of social anxiety disorder. Teacher asks a question. My thought might be, if I get it wrong, I'll seem dumb. What if I blush? Everyone's going to laugh. Of course, I feel terrible. My anxiety system kicks up. Then I don't raise my hand. If the teacher does call on me, I look down and I shrug until she moves on. And again, I'm going to feel better once she moves on, but I never have the opportunity to learn that I actually could have answered that question. Or even if I didn't know, if I said, I don't know, people don't care that much about what I'm doing. Specific phobia, this is an example of dental phobia, which you see a lot. So kid doesn't want to go to the dentist, thinks it's going to be so painful when they clean my teeth. I have a little bit of this myself. And so they, refuse to go, throw a huge tantrum. Maybe they have to be held down in the dentist chair, which of course makes it even more unpleasant. But once they escape from it, they do feel better. And again, their behavior is reinforced, their expectancies remain. We could go all day, right? Panic disorder is actually, the fear stimulus is our own body's natural sensations, right? Like my arm is tingling, probably because it's asleep. But if I am very sensitive to anxiety, I may think, oh my God, my arm's tingling, I'm probably having a heart attack. And then I experience all of that onset of physical symptoms, and maybe I go lie down, maybe I take a beta blocker. But what I never get the chance to learn that actually the symptoms of panic, although unpleasant, are not dangerous. And I can just continue on. I can walk around, I could run, and I'd be okay. So that is the biopsychosocial model of anxiety. And it's pretty well established. It's been proven actually in animal models, in human models, that avoidance increases anxiety because it is reinforcing to us to stop feeling uncomfortable. We don't like to feel uncomfortable. Now, different people have different tolerance for feeling uncomfortable, right? Some kids are super sensitive. We call that your anxiety sensitivity. And we all range from like 0 to 100 on anxiety sensitivity. Some people are super sensitive. They notice every bodily sensation. They notice every possible threat that could be around. And some people are really kind of, less sensitive. And that's probably temperamental. People kind of come into the world that way. And that's one of the reasons why anxiety has a large genetic component, right? So it's not only about things that we actually experience, it's also just about the way we're wired to be more vigilant about anxiety or to be less. Okay, so I mentioned that when we're in the presence of something scary, our cognitive system activates a neural network. And I'm going to call that our fear structure. So a fear structure is basically kind of like a set of beliefs that we carry about the source of our fear, right? So for example, if your fear is a spider, then your fear structure is going to include what being around a spider means to you. Maybe it means I'm going to get poisoned. I'm going to be bit by a poisonous spider. Our fear structure also includes our physical response. Oh my God, when I'm around a spider, my heart pounds and I hate that. It might also include information about what will happen in the future. If I'm around this spider, I'm definitely going to get bit and then I'll go to the hospital. Now, it's not that you're consciously thinking all these things. It's that like instantaneously when you're around a spider, that part of your brain like lights up. Those neural networks start firing and all that information becomes rapidly available to you and makes you feel super uncomfortable. So fear structures include all the information about the thing that you're afraid of, what happens to your body when you experience it, what being around it means for you, for your world. And it can be formed by actual experience, but it can also be informed by totally vicarious learning or misattributions. That is to say, not everybody who is afraid of dogs was bit by a dog, right? Not everybody who is afraid of heights had a terrifying experience at the top of the Eiffel Tower or something like that. Some people just, they pick up on environmental cues. Other people are afraid of this, therefore I am, or they make a lot of kind of accidental misattributions where they just assume things are scary. Yeah, a lot of kind of genetic components there. So I'm going to talk about my own fear structure. I mentioned I see some people turning away. This is someone else's fear too. I'm sorry if this is yours, Deborah. I see you not looking at the screen. I didn't mean to flood you. So I'm really afraid of rats. And I used to live in New York City, as I mentioned, for many, many years. And the subway system is full of rats, basically. And so when I am around a rat, my fear structure gets immediately activated. And I think rats are dirty and they carry disease. I actually saw a client for a while. I was treating for trauma who actually had rats fall on them from the ceiling. And I was treating this kid for trauma. So he was retelling the story of that over and over to me, which actually really kind of was very hard for me to hear and kind of sensitized me to my fear of rats. I might think that rats would like to gnaw on my face. I might think about their physical characteristics and how disgusting I think they are. I'm going to think about my body, what happens to me when I see a rat. I'm sweating. I feel short of breath. My heart's pounding. I feel like I might throw up. And then I think about the future and I think this whole place is crawling with rats. I'm not safe. I will die if a rat touches me. Again, none of this is conscious. This is all happening like instantaneously, but that's my fear structure. It's activated in the presence of rats, but it's also activated even when there are no rats. If I'm just in the subway, for example, or if I watch a YouTube video, do you guys remember the pizza rat that people were sending a lot of memes about many years ago? It was like a rat carrying a huge piece of pizza down the subway stairs. I mean, that freaks me out. My daughter has a stuffed rat that can actually activate my fear structure. So, and a friend sent that to her as kind of like a mean joke because they know I'm afraid of rats. So you can see how the fear structure gets activated. And that structure remains in place unless we have new learning. And that new learning has to be pretty intentional. We have to be very aware of it. So let's say I got some therapy. I did some exposure, which we're going to talk about what that is. And I learned new things about rats. I learned, well, rats are actually more scared of me than I am of them. I did let a rat crawl on me and I was okay. I didn't die. I hear rats are really smart. And most importantly, I can tolerate the anxious feelings that seeing a rat causes for me. If I have the opportunity for that new learning, what it does is it actually inhibits that old learning. It makes that fear structure less accessible. It doesn't make it go away completely. It makes it less accessible. I have to keep accessing this new information in order to keep that old information from kind of reemerging. And that's really important when you think about relapse, because people can actually do really well with something they're afraid of, and then it can kind of come back. So I actually, when I first went to graduate school, I hadn't driven in a long time and I had to drive, and I had a really kind of a lot of anxiety about driving. But, I went to graduate school in the city. I drove. And then I moved away to do my residency and my fellowship. And I lived in New York and Boston.
You're on mute. You're on
I
mute.
don't know how I got muted, but I'm unmuted now. Sorry. So I don't know when I stopped talking, but when you stopped hearing me, but I was just saying that I overcame a driving phobia, but then when I didn't drive for 10 years, it came back. And that's because I stopped accessing that new information I had about how I could be safe in a car and how I actually could drive and was competent. And therefore the old information became more accessible again. Okay, so that's the biopsychosocial model of anxiety. And now I want to talk about exposure-based CBT for anxiety disorders. So we have another poll. I'm curious to know, oh, some of you already answered. I'm curious to know how familiar you are with exposure-based CBT. I just want to get a sense. You can be totally honest because I don't know. These are anonymous. I don't know who's saying what. So feel no anxiety about giving me the answer I want. Just say what's true. Thanks for everybody who's, okay, finally someone's like, yeah, that sounds bad. I don't want to do that. I hope I can convince you by the end. So a fair number of you are pretty familiar, have used it maybe a little bit. A smaller number of you, it's part of your regular practice. Some of you know about it, but have never had the opportunity to use it. And some of you are pretty skeptical that this is a good idea. And I don't blame you. Okay, so my question is next, what's your comfort level if you have used it? Or if you do know about it. When you think about using it, how do you feel? I really appreciate everybody's honesty. It's not unusual for therapists to feel tentative about doing something that makes people feel scared, right? None of us really signed up for this profession probably because we enjoy making people uncomfortable. We actually usually, my experience is usually mental health providers and other people in the helping professions get into this work because we like helping people and making them feel better, not worse, right? So I can totally understand why, you can understand something in theory and still feel like it might be hard to do. Okay, well, I'm going to talk a little bit about standard cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety. So CBT for anxiety is above and beyond the most well-established, best practice treatment for child and adolescent anxiety. There's so much research about that. And I'll show you some stuff in a little bit. There's really actually no other treatment that we have in mental health that is as effective or has shown itself to be as effective as CBT for anxiety. So that's great news. Usually CBT for anxiety includes like a lot of different parts. So there's psychoeducation, teaching kids about fear and about, how it works. And there's the anxiety management strategies that a lot of you might be really familiar with. These usually include things like relaxation, cognitive restructuring, maybe problem solving, emotion identification. Those are considered anxiety management strategies. Then there's developing a fear hierarchy, understanding kind of the order of the things that you're afraid of, how they, from your greatest fear to your least, and then doing exposure. Sometimes with response prevention, that's for OCD, where in addition to exposure, you're also suppressing doing rituals. And then we go into maintenance and relapse prevention. And usually in these kind of typical CBT packages for anxiety, we don't get to exposure until like session 9, if we're following a protocol. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I know in a lot of the settings where I work or have worked, kids are not hanging around for 9 sessions. I may never get to a 9th session with a family. So that's one big problem with kind of front loading all of these anxiety management strategies. So really, my case today is to talk about why we should be focusing much more on exposure and a lot less on anxiety management if we focus on it at all. And this is usually a big shift for people, because if I ask folks what the most common thing they use to treat anxiety, usually people tell me relaxation or deep breathing. That's usually their go-to. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. So what is exposure? I've been using this word a lot. Exposure is repeated intentional introduction to the anxiety source or its context. So I might be being exposed to actual rats, but I might also just be being exposed to going into the subway, maybe going into the subway and holding some cheese out or something like that. So it's intentional introduction to the source of the anxiety or its context, but without the intention to cause any danger. And that's really important. So here again is that separation anxiety case that we looked at before. Exposure, we intervene right here where the behavior is, okay? The behavior before was get out of the situation, call mom, have mom come home. The exposure behavior would be, we're going to talk to mom, we're going to plan, she's going to leave, let's say only for 20 minutes, because we're just starting, we're getting the kid used to this. The kid's going to feel more afraid in the beginning. Their fear will increase. Their fear structure gets activated. But over time, what happens is sometimes the fear actually decreases. That's called habituation, and we'll talk about that. But more importantly, what happens is new learning occurs. Remember, that new learning can kind of suppress the old learning. And the new learning might be, yeah, nothing bad happened to me. And also, hey, I can tolerate feeling uncomfortable. I can handle it. And then maybe you feel calmer the next time it happens, or maybe not. Maybe you still feel anxious, but you also have this new learning to rely on. Okay, so I said CBT above and beyond is the most effective treatment for anxiety in children. This is just a review of the evidence base for different treatments for kids. And these are all the treatments that have the best support or are most well established. And you can see CBT is number one with 46 separate studies where they tested kids either getting CBT or getting something else and found that CBT outperformed the comparison condition. And when I say CBT, I mean all those different things: exposure, anxiety management, etc. But you can see right below that, equally with as much support, is just exposure all by itself, with 32 separate studies showing that if you just use exposure without all those other strategies, it's also very, very effective. And so, think about this. The CBT includes exposure, and exposure alone is also super effective. So we don't know what's effective about CBT packages. It could be the anxiety management strategies. There's no evidence to suggest that it is. There's no studies of relaxation alone that have been shown to be effective. But there are lots of studies of exposure alone that have been shown to be effective. Right? So with all of this, you'd think, oh my gosh, well, everyone should be doing CBT. And surely everyone is, right? But actually, no. Anxiety disorders are the most prevalent mental health problem with a lifetime prevalence of 30%. And sadly, most kids will never get exposure therapy, even if they get treatment. So about 7 to 11% of people who have an anxiety disorder will actually receive exposure-based CBT. So 90% about will not. 40% of child therapists report never using exposure. And even if they did use it, they reported they're more likely to use other strategies first, strategies that have no scientific support. And exposure is less often used than these other things: identifying emotions, problem solving, breathing, relaxation, et cetera. So that's a real conundrum. It would be like saying, well, we have penicillin, but we don't give it out. We try other things first. And just in case you're interested, these are all the different things that have been shown to have either minimal support, like they don't seem to work very well, or no support, and maybe even are performing less well than other therapies, right? And you might see some things that you recognize on here, like client-centered therapy, which is sort of just supportive talk therapy. which a lot of people do, and is good for many things, but is not going to cure anxiety disorders. Okay, so I hope I'm convincing you that therapists should use exposure. We believe it's the mechanism of action in all effective treatment of anxiety. Right? So when CBT works, we think it's because of exposure. When exposure alone works, we know it's because of exposure. And there's consensus in the field about that exposure is the key active ingredient in the treatment of anxiety disorder. There are other things that might be good, but that would be like making guacamole with onions, tomatoes, garlic, and no avocado. You got to have the avocado, right? You got to have exposure to treat anxiety disorders. We even know that the earlier therapists use exposure in a course of treatment for a kid, the better the kid does overall. So like not waiting, because some people will say, well, I use exposure, but first I like to get them ready. I like to give them some strategies. I like to help them do their deep breathing. This research suggests actually get to it fast because it's the thing that's most helpful. And remember I said, if you don't keep accessing your new learning, then your anxiety can kind of come back spontaneously, like my driving phobia did. Well, about half of kids who get standard CBT show spontaneous relapse within 6 years. So they get better, but then it comes back. And one of the reasons we think that is because people are not using exposure like to its maximal benefit. They're not using it early. They're teaching other strategies that kind of get in the way or dilute the experience of exposure. And they are not focusing enough on the new learning. So everything I'm going to teach you guys from this point forward is going to be focused on how to do exposure in a way that really maximizes new learning. So you've got to activate the fear structure. There's no way to treat anxiety disorders without making kids feel fear. So that's the first thing we just all have to wrap our heads around. And in fact, helping kids to avoid feeling anxious kind of sends a message to them that we believe anxiety is dangerous, that we believe they can't handle it. And for a lot of anxious kids, that's been their whole life. Their parents, because they love them, have been accommodating their anxiety, trying to get them out of situations that are scary or helping them plan for how they're going to handle scary situations way in advance. And again, that sort of sends a message of like, I don't know if you can really handle this. This could be really bad, right? Here are the top 10 negative beliefs. You guys remember Dave Letterman and his top 10 list? This is my version of that for negative beliefs about exposure. First of all, therapists may believe it's unethical because, we all have a duty. I think pretty much every professional discipline wants to do no harm, right? And if you think you're making kids feel bad, that kind of feels like harm. But actually, one of our other ethical duties, usually in every helping profession, is to offer the intervention that has the most support, the thing that will be most helpful to clients. And remember that we're never exposing people to things that are actually harmful. We're exposing them to things that they misattribute as harmful or misinterpret their ability to handle, but that are actually safe. Some people will say, this works fine for a simple phobia like fear of, snakes, because you can just show people pictures of snakes and bring in a snake or whatever. But it wouldn't work with my clients' complex fears. And I will just say that I have been doing this work for 20 years now. It's just hard to believe because I'm only, 30. And I have supervised hundreds and hundreds of clients, of therapists at this point in all kinds of different settings. And I have yet to meet an anxiety disorder we can't figure out a way to do exposure with. I lost my eye there. It's uncomfortable. That's true. It's uncomfortable for kids, and it might be uncomfortable for you, actually. In fact, part of what therapists need to get comfortable with exposure is, you guessed it, exposure to exposure. Hopefully we'll get a little bit of that today. It's too hard and complicated. It does require some planning, right? You got to think about what is the kid afraid of and how am I going to bring them into contact with that, or how am I going to plan with their parents or their teachers or their foster parent or grandma to get them in contact with that. But it is actually the most simple of interventions, as you will see. Some people will say the kid is exposed all the time and they're still scared. Like they go to school every day and it's not helping them with their school phobia. Well, there's a difference between intentionally exposing yourself to things in a slow and kind of steady, gradual manner where you actually can kind of take it in and learn new information, and being like thrown into the deep end of the pool where you're so worried about drowning, you don't learn anything, right? It's kind of the difference between, if you think about vaccines are a small amount of the disease that we get that helps to protect us against the disease. Exposure is like that. It's giving people a small amount of fear at a time so they can build up immunity. We don't have the right tools or settings. That's part of what we're going to talk about today, is how to get that, how to figure out what you need. It's too time consuming. Actually, exposure is much briefer than most other therapies. The child doesn't want to do this. Yes, that's true. And that's why the child is in the pickle that they're in, right? Because they don't want to do it and people have let them not do it. I can't get them to do something they're afraid of. They just won't do it. We're going to talk about strategies for starting low and going slow to help build kids' confidence and get them on the road to recovery from anxiety disorders. And then lastly, some people are like, this can't be it. It seems too simple. But that's kind of the beauty of it, I think. All right. So I've talked a lot. Let me pause. This is our first Q&A period, and then we're going to have a break. By the way, I'm watching a lot of faces, and I so appreciate I'm seeing smiles and nods, and it's just really great to see folks so actively engaged. So happy to answer some questions now. You can unmute yourself if you feel comfortable doing that, or you can write it in the chat.
I would just, if you could elaborate, because I've heard a lot of the same stuff in regards to like coaches and contact sports, where, young boys learn to get hit on a football field and they fall down and get back up, basically dust themselves off and play some more.
Right.
But I know, like for me as a young child, I remember the fear of getting hit by the kid, I'm in junior high, or getting hit by the varsity, and you're on the junior varsity.
Yeah.
For the first time, and a fear of getting hit by the varsity players at practice, or even the fear of catching a baseball with a glove, the fear of being hit in the face by the baseball and having to basically work. Like I wanted to play baseball, I wanted to learn, but at the same time, I did have a genuine fear of the baseball hitting me in the face.
Yeah. Okay, that's a great question. So I want to first make the distinction between reasonable fear and irrational fear. I think if you're a little scrawny JV player and someone wants you to go on the field with, 250-pound high school seniors or something, you might have good reason to be fearful. And that actually is not an unrealistic fear, right? But let's take being hit in the face with a baseball when you're playing baseball. Chances are that kids who are afraid of that are overestimating the likelihood that that's going to happen. I mean, if you watch kids play baseball, does that happen every game? Does it happen to every kid every game? It's probably actually pretty infrequent that happens, and even less frequent that it happens and it's really a disaster, breaks a kid's nose or something like that, causes a concussion. Mostly because kids don't throw that hard. But anyway, this is a good example of something where we could build like a ladder and start low and go slow, right? We could start with me gently tossing,
or like
a soft ball towards you,
right,
and then work our way up to a harder ball. We might even have you catch, like a big bouncy ball in the face to find out, okay, it's not that bad, right? There are lots of things we could do to try to help you acquire new learning about that situation.
Like dodgeball.
Yeah, I mean, I think dodgeball fears are pretty rational, to be honest with you. Actually traumatic. We're not talking about trauma today, but I hope I answered your question, Donald.
All right, thank you.
Other questions? But just to be clear, exposure is never about helping kids be not anxious in a dangerous situation, right? We're not training kids to like run into a burning house. We're not training kids to get into physical fights. and not be afraid of them. That's, we are helping kids overcome irrational fears where they either overestimate the likelihood of it happening, overestimate how bad it's going to be, or underestimate their own ability to handle it.
And I just wanted to add, when you're talking about snakes and spiders and stuff, I have heard that that's ingrained in like the DNA.
Yeah,
So
it's
some of
if you think about it, it's very adaptive evolutionarily, right? If we think about survival as of the fittest, to avoid anything that you think might be poisonous, that could kill you.
Some of those animals, like I don't know if you've ever heard the term crouching tiger, hidden dragon, but like a hidden dragon is an ambush predator. Like we have alligators where I'm from, and you won't even see the thing that you're afraid of being an alligator.
Right. But
You have
Donald,
to
I'm
actually-
never going to do exposure for kids not being afraid of alligators. They should be afraid of alligators, but I might do exposures for them being afraid to go on a swamp tour
Right.
because those are actually safe. So just to clarify, like we are not exposing people to things that are actually dangerous. And yes, it's true. A lot of things, someone mentioned they have a needle stick phobia. And I don't know if that's because you pass out when you see blood. But that's a really good example of something that is hardwired. And it actually is brilliant. If you think about it, if you're bleeding and you pass out, first of all, your body is prone. So your heart is going to be at the same level as the wound. Secondly, your heart rate slows when you pass out. So it's actually could be life-saving if you were bleeding. But what happens is it's like a little, it's like a natural alarm system has gone wrong, has gone awry. And now you're passing out when you see other people's blood, or when you see someone getting a needle stick on TV, or when you are, giving blood in a very safe way, like, at the doctor's office for labs. So that's just a good example of something that, yeah, it can be hardwired and it might have been adaptive under some circumstances, but it's not adaptive the way it's working now.
How would that fear, or how would you go with that? Like the coyote you showed, that's a predator that we have a natural fear of that stalks its prey.
But I'm not going to expose people to coyotes. I'm going to expose them to the places that they're avoiding because they're afraid of coyotes. So I'm going to get more into the details about how I would do it
versus, well, like
when we come back.
Just versus snakes, which use camouflage or ambush.
Yeah, but most snakes are not poisonous, so I would actually expose kids to harmless snakes. Okay. Other questions?
What about generalized anxiety disorder? How would you approach that topic?
Thank you for asking. That's at the end of the talk. I'm going to actually talk about that because generalized anxiety disorder is different in the sense that there is a lot less avoidance. Typically, we don't see kids with GAD really being able to avoid all the things that they're worried about, right? Because they're worried about so many different things. New things are popping up all the time. And so I'm going to talk later about how we do what's called a worry exposure with kids who have generalized anxiety disorder. Because one of the theories of GAD is that the worry is actually there to help them avoid their emotional experience. So in a funny way, the worry is the avoidance. And what they're really trying to avoid is all of the sort of negative affect that they experience. So I will talk about how we actually can do exposure to that affect. But great question, because it operates differently, doesn't it? Okay. Well, we'll have time for more questions later. If you think of a question, chat it in and I can address it. But we're going to go, you guys are due a 10-minute break. So I am going to have us break for 10 minutes. So come back at, if you're in Texas, it'll be 10:20. Do we have anywhere on Eastern Standard Time or Mountain Time or anything like that? If you're in Central Standard Time, it'll be 10:20. Feel free to mute and hide your camera, but stay logged in. Whatever. But at some point, we have to fade it out because what happens is kids start to attribute their success to the magical safety signal, whatever it is, their parent, their cell phone, their rabbit's foot, their medication, their benzos that they carry, whatever. And we don't want them to attribute their success, their ability to get through it, to anything other than their ability to tolerate fear, if that makes sense. But we'll go into detail about fading safeties. Good question. Anything else? Okay, well, let's keep moving. So, what happens during exposure? So initially, when the kid, the student, client, whatever your preferred language is, confronts the scary thing, the people, the activities, the thoughts, the memories, whatever it is, a lot of different things happen. But first of all, one thing for sure happens is that their anxiety increases because their fear structure is being activated, right? So that neural network, what is the thing? What's going to happen to me when I'm with the thing? What happens to my body when I'm with the thing? What's going to happen in the future? What's the worst thing that can happen? All of that gets, activated. Over time, anxiety sometimes just kind of comes down. This is like sort of like getting used to cold water, where we call that habituation, right? Like when you get into a pool first, it feels really cold and then it starts to feel comfortable. So some people, that happens to them over time. The more they stay in anxiety provoking situations, they actually get used to it and their anxiety levels decrease. That's very common, but it's not actually necessary. When I first learned how to do CBT for anxiety and exposure, we thought you needed to have people habituate in order to get better. We now know habituation actually doesn't predict whether or not people get better and stay better. What predicts that is consolidation of new learning. So that's why I'm focusing on that more. So that's where this next thing comes in. If the client repeatedly confronts the scary situation, right, and they actually really experience it and they pay attention during it, when their expectancy for what will happen is violated, that is, when what they predict will happen does not come true, they will have what we call a corrective learning experience. So they'll learn the situation or memory is not actually dangerous. They'll learn that even if things don't go well, it's not as bad as they think. Like even if some kids do yawn during their talk, it's not the humiliation that they thought it would be. They learn, probably the most important lesson, that these distressing feelings, feeling nervous, feeling your heart race, feeling your stomach hurt, they're tolerable. They're not dangerous. They're uncomfortable, but you can tolerate them. And learn that you can actually handle this situation, that you are brave enough, strong enough, together enough to handle it. I always tell kids that the definition of courage is bravery in the face of fear. So if you don't feel fear, you don't have the opportunity to show courage.
That's why in Asia, the worry beads are so popular.
So I'm sure some of you were trained in a more habituation model, which means feeling less distress and discomfort as you do exposures, right? That looks like this. So you get in the situation, and as time passes, your distress starts to go down. Maybe this is over the course of one session. You do 5 repeated exposures to looking at that picture of throw up. And over time, they're less distressed. And then the next time you meet with them, they start lower and they habituate more quickly. The next time they start even lower and habituate more quickly. That is nice when that happens. I love habituation. It makes people feel that they're getting somewhere. It makes them feel engaged. It makes them feel confident. It's helpful for keeping clients coming back if they start to feel less anxiety over time when they're seeing you. But it's not actually the goal of exposure the way we used to think it was. And I kind of like to know that because it lets me off the hook. Some kids, their anxiety is stubborn and it doesn't decrease. And that's okay. Habituation is not the goal of exposure. Violation of expectancy, having what you think is going to happen not happen. That's the goal of exposure. And having corrective learning that you can tolerate anxiety. So corrective learning is new information about what actually and typically happens in the presence of the source of fear. So it's a new emotional experience, how I feel and what happens to those feelings over time. A new physiological experience. The arousal occurs. Yes, my heart is pounding, but it's tolerable. I don't have a heart attack. Other people can't tell. Yes. And then the violation of expectancies, what you expected to happen doesn't happen, or sometimes it does happen, guys, but you can handle it, right? And you develop these feelings of competency and self-efficacy. This is the new learning that inhibits the old learning, keeps it from being accessible. So we can't violate expectancies. We can't prove to kids that what they believe will happen doesn't happen unless we put them in the situation. Some other types of therapies try to help kids see that what they think is going to happen is not going to happen through talking, cognitive restructuring. Not as effective. Really, changing behavior changes feelings and changes how we think.
I meant prayer beads, not worry. I meant prayer beads
So-
and worry stones are like praying a rosary. Got it.
So I'm going to talk about safety behaviors a little bit later. Those are definitely both examples of that. To stop reinforcing avoidance and misperception of threat. So, every time a situation is avoided, escaped, or a grown-up says, you're going to be okay, this won't be that bad, it'll be over soon, it really does reinforce this misperception of threat. So even though people think they're being nice when they say, I know sitting in the cafeteria is scary for you, so how about if you come into my office during lunch? You think you're being nice, but actually what you're kind of sending a message to this kid is, yeah, this cafeteria is bad news. And if you go in there, you're not going to be able to handle it. And if you feel anxious, that's really bad. So we better avoid that, right? So when adults assist in avoidance or provide a lot of ways to get through it, it just accidentally confirms the child's misperception of the threat and also misperception of their own competency. We know that kids with anxiety disorders believe themselves to be less competent than other kids. We want all kids to feel like they can handle things, they can take things on, they can thrive, right? So we want kids to be in control of and not controlled by their anxieties and worries, right? Anxiety is something that can be managed. It's never going to be removed. Right? I tell parents, I don't do anxiety-ectomies. Okay. We all need anxiety. It keeps us safe. It keeps us alert. And anxious kids going to stay anxious. Okay. They're wired to be more sensitive, but that doesn't mean that they have to avoid things or let it control their lives or their behavior. They can move towards their goals even while they feel anxious. So there's a lot of different types of exposure you guys may have heard about. There is, gradual or graduated exposure. That's what people usually talk about. That's systematic exposure to the feared thing, beginning with lower threat and progressing through the hierarchy, usually with habituation. So within gradual exposure, you can do imaginal exposure, just thinking about the thing. You can do in vivo exposure, which is when you expose them to the real threat stimuli, like a picture of a snake, a video of a snake, bringing in a snake, having them walk up to a group of kids they don't know and introduce themselves. These are all in vivos. That's a real exposure. Interoceptive is exposure to bodily sensations. We do that for kids who have panic disorder. I will talk about that at the end. Exposure with relaxation is systematic desensitization. Don't do that. Relaxation slows down the success of exposure. It distracts, it gets in the way, it dilutes it, and it makes kids think that their body is dangerous and they need to turn the volume down on their arousal. So I'll talk more about that in a minute, but that's been shown to be true. Even though most therapists do think relaxation is for anxiety disorders, it's actually not that helpful. It can actually be problematic for kids with panic. Trying to relax can actually make them panic because they're focusing on their bodies too much. It's completely benign for OCD. It has no effect. And it definitely should never be done at the same time as exposure. Flooding is when you expose someone to something at the very top of their fear hierarchy to start, and then just keep them in that situation for a long time. Flooding is very effective. This would be like bringing in the snake phobic, and I have a boa constrictor and I wrap it around them, right? It's very effective, but the problem is a lot of times people drop out of therapy if you do that because they're too afraid, they're too scared. So the only time I do flooding is sometimes I've done these like really intensive cases where someone might fly in from another country and I work with them for like 3 days in a row. And I know that I have them for 3 days in a row. I might do flooding with them, but I don't do it in typical outpatient work. And then prolonged exposure. There was a great question about that. That's for trauma. Jordan asked, that's when you do repeated confrontation of the traumatic memories through the retelling of them. And I do think like that really requires its own separate training probably. All right. We've reached your second break. So here's the basic guidelines for exposure. You are going to use the fear hierarchy as your guide. It's not a contract. Like I said, it could be flexible, but that's kind of your blueprint. I always try to set that first occasion for success. There are a couple of things I want to accomplish the first time I do exposure with a kid. I want them, yes, to make some strides on overcoming their anxiety disorder, but I also want them to, first of all, understand and buy in to what exposure is. Secondly, have a sense of mastery, competency, self-efficacy. And thirdly, want to come back and see me again. So those are my 3 goals. So I try to prepare a kid, not too much. Remember that sometimes with anxious kids, people have been like sort of over preparing them, like this is what you can expect, and then this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen, which actually does, again, kind of reinforce this notion that like they can't handle things. So we don't want to go over the top, but you do want to prepare them. Like, we're going to work, we agreed we're going to work on this. And so next time I see you, we'll start with that kind of thing. And then you want to choose something you're confident is going to go pretty well. It doesn't have to, that doesn't mean they don't feel afraid. You need them to feel afraid. But for example, if I'm working with a kid who has social phobia and doesn't talk to a lot of people, doesn't like to call people on the phone, doesn't like to talk to people at restaurants, doesn't like to hear their own voice relate to other people, I'm not starting with having them talk to some of their peers, because I don't know how that's going to go, and I want to build them up first. And it's okay if it doesn't go perfectly, but for that first one, I want it to go pretty well. So I might think about like, well, what do I think they could probably definitely do? I think they could probably definitely call a bookstore and ask them what their hours are. Something like that, something low stakes, but still that engenders that anxiety. So that's the next thing. It's got to be anxiety provoking. It has to be intense enough to activate the fear structure. If you start with something that's so low, they're like, why am I doing this? It's not helping me. Also, you need to make sure that you've set up something where you're going to have enough time and information to provide new learning opportunities. So if you only have time to do an exposure one time, that doesn't really give kids a lot of information, new information. So usually we want to talk about, it's sort of like working out. It's like lifting weights where you do reps and sets, right? You want to have a lot of reps every time you do a set of exposure. Then you're going to take ratings, 0 to 10, 0 to 100, 0 to 8, does not matter. Emoji of happy face, emoji of a scared face, doesn't matter, as long as it makes sense to you and the kid you're working with. Pay attention to their behavior, because there could be safety behaviors happening that you don't know about. Like they're mumbling the Hail Mary, they're, clutching their rabbit's foot, they're spinning for panic to get dizzy, but they're keeping their eyes closed. Could be lots of things. And then you want to debrief. How'd it go? What did you learn? And then you want to do it again. Sometimes when folks are new to exposure, they'll do an exposure once and then they spend the rest of the meeting talking about it. And really, I think about it like a football game where there's the play and then the huddle and then the play. Huddle is brief. We want to get back to the play. So yeah, you talk about it, get a fear rating, get their predictions. What do you think is going to happen? What's the worst thing that can happen? Do the exposure, talk about it. How did that go? What's your fear now? Did your expectancy come true? And let's do it again to do that too. So now let's talk about making every moment count with exposure. Like, how do you really make sure it's as effective as it can be? Because it'll be effective no matter what, but it might take a while. And these are some strategies, some tips and tricks to kind of make it more impactful when you do it. So we're going to talk about violating expectancies, which we talked about a little bit, but I'm going to get deeper. We're going to talk about removing safety signals. Again, that kind of got brought up before with a security blanket. I'm going to talk about deepened or compound extinction, variability, multiple contexts, and occasionally actually reinforcing expectancy. So these are all just a bunch of crazy words, but I'm about to
what would be the term?
If you don't mind holding on, I'm going to totally go through everything on this list. I want to explain it. Okay. So anxiety expectancies, we already talked about. That's what the client believes is going to happen when they're in the presence of the threat, the fear source. It's what they think is going to happen, how they think their body's going to feel, how they think they're going to cope or not cope, and how long it's going to last. They might not always have words for this. Like, someone who's afraid of spiders might not actively be thinking that's a tarantula and it will kill me. but their fear is happening in the way it is because that's what's being activated. So sometimes you just have to ask them repeatedly, okay, and then what would happen? Okay, and then what would happen? And what's the worst thing that could happen to get at the expectancy? So here's an example. When I give a presentation, everyone will laugh. They're going to judge me, and I will burst into tears, and I'll be so embarrassed, and that feeling will last forever. Probably the kid is not offering that up to me. I'm asking them some questions. I'm saying, okay, so if you give a presentation, you said your voice will shake. What then? Well, everyone will laugh. Okay. And if people laugh, then what? What's the worst that could happen? I guess if I burst into tears would be really bad. Okay. And if you did burst into tears, then what? Oh, I'd just be so embarrassed. Yeah, I get it. And how long do you think that feeling of being embarrassed would last? It would last forever. We could keep going, right? I could say, like, after class, what will happen in the cafeteria? Well, no one will sit with me because I just humiliated myself, right? So we want to get real specific about what the expectancy is, because expectancy violation is the mismatch between what people expect to have happen and what actually happens. And that's one of the reasons why, and I'll say this again later, you don't want to spend time convincing kids that the bad thing's not going to happen before you do the exposure. Because if you do, you're actually lowering their expectancy. And exposure is most effective when there's this huge mismatch between what you think is going to happen and what actually happens. Yeah, so that's expectancy violation. And so you want them to see that what actually happens is, well, maybe the scary thing doesn't happen at all. And that is frequently the case, right? Like if a kid has obsessive compulsive disorder and they believe that if they step on a crack in the sidewalk, their mother will die, I'm pretty confident that we can step on some cracks together and their mom's gonna be fine, right? But sometimes the scary thing does happen, right? If you bring a dog into session and the dog does actually bark in kind of a scary way, you can't control that, right? Like we hope that we're bringing a docile, sweet dog in, but it could bark, could be scary. So another thing you want to kind of try to violate is that, okay, it occurred, but it's not as bad as you thought it would be. It occurs, but they're able to manage it. It occurs, but the feelings are tolerable and temporary, okay? And the greater that contrast between expectancy and what happens, the more learning can occur. So how do you violate expectancies? You, first of all, have to be super specific when you are, before you do an exposure, you want to explicitly get the expectancy. And so you heard me do that a little bit with Lily. She did say it would be awkward, but then I was sort of like, well, okay, so it'll be awkward, but what's the worst thing that could happen? And she said, well, we'll just stare at each other and then she'll hang up and then I'll just be so embarrassed for a long time. Then you want to try to design the exposure in a way that really violates that expectancy. And then after the exposure, you talk about what actually happened. You kind of are like a curious detective. You're like, I never watched Columbo. That's like before my time. But I guess like the whole thing there would be he'd ask a lot of really obvious questions and get the witness to kind of confess. So that's kind of what you're doing. You're saying like, so wait, what happened? You were sure you were going to throw up. Did that happen? You were sure that you would actually continue to feel nauseated for a really long time. Are you still feeling nauseated? You want to ask whether it actually occurred, and you want to try to use really objective anchors, okay? So we never want the expectancy to be, I'm going to feel afraid, or I'll be so scared, because that is what we expect to happen. We don't want to, we think that will happen, right? And also that's subjective. We want to use, as to the extent that we can, we want to use objective markers of the prediction. Okay, so making the expectancy specific, a vague expectancy. If I see a spider, I'll freak out because I'll be so scared. Well, I don't know what objective things I'm looking for here. So instead, I want to get to a point where I might have to ask a lot of questions. If I see a spider, I'll be so scared that I'll pass out immediately. And while I'm passed out, that spider is going to bite me. And we could keep going. And if it bites you, then what? Well, even if it's not a poisonous spider, we'll have to trap it and I'll have to go take it to a lab so they can figure out if I'm about to die. So you want to try to define the testable beliefs about the thing that they're afraid is going to happen. And you can get there by saying, what's the worst that can happen? Under what conditions will that happen? How will we know if that happens? When will it happen? How long will it last? After that, what happens next? Until you feel like you've gotten to a testable prediction. So expectancy change happens over time as the result of expectancy violation, okay? And not everybody learns at the same rate, because actually there's a theory that people with anxiety disorders, because they are often actually having their expectancies violated, right? Like every time a kid with separation anxiety is forced to be away from their parent and they cry the whole time, they are actually having their expectancies violated, sort of, although they're actually miserable and they're not really taking anything in because all they're doing is trying to get their parent to come home, right? But in general, they think that people with anxiety disorders might actually kind of have slower learning about expectancy violation. So some people learn really quickly. You do a couple expectancy violations, they generalize to all their fears and they're fine. And they feel great and they know what to do. And other people learn more slowly. So, you know, how much you have to violate expectancies is going to vary person to person. But helping people consolidate the information that they learned is a way to help people learn faster. So not just doing it, but then telling you about it, walking you through. And you saw me do this with Lily. What did you learn? Did that happen? If she had, let's say, done a bunch of exposures over the weekend, and then I saw her again, I'd say, tell me about all the exposures you did. We planned for them. Did anything that you expected to happen? Oh, it didn't. What did you learn in that situation? And what are you learning in general? And you're always wanting to do these little consolidation interviews when you first start seeing somebody after exposures and then in between sessions too. Here are some of those questions. Did it happen? What did you notice about what did happen? How did you feel during it? How did you feel after it? Have you been noticing any patterns across these exposures? Again, these things seem obvious, but we want the kids to say that because saying it kind of solidifies the new learning. Okay, the second, that's violation of expectancies. The second way to maximize exposure is to get rid of safety behaviors or safety signals. So these are any actions, overt or covert, that kids are doing that are basically designed to either avert the threat or help them cope with the threat. So here are some examples. For anxious kids with generalized anxiety disorder, one of the things they love to do is check with people, and I call it polling. Like I'll ask Kyle, do you think people are going to enjoy this training? Do you think people are going to be bored? Do you think a lot of people are going to leave? And he'll be like, no, it's going to be great. And then I say, okay, thanks. And then I call Deborah. Deborah, I'm really nervous. What do you think? Do you think it's going to be okay? You think people are going to hang up? You think people are going to write mean letters about it afterwards? Anyway, I go from person to person and I'm polling and I'm never satisfied. And the tricky thing is people don't know I'm going to multiple. So they feel good. They feel like they're really helping me, not knowing that I'm actually, and it is funny, but you know, attention to that worry actually makes the worry worse. So that's one example. Rehearsal. A lot of people do this with kids. Like, let's practice over and over and over again. Like a little rehearsal is fine, right? I'm not saying stop practicing, stop rehearsing, but like, for example, let's rehearse going to this birthday party. Let's, let's rehearse how you're going to talk to your new friends on the first day of school. A lot of rehearsal, if it's too much rehearsal, can actually be a way of trying to kind of ward off anything bad happening. Reassurance seeking, that's very similar to checking and polling. Avoidance, obviously. Distraction is a safety behavior. So doing like, mental math in my head during an anxious situation because it distracts me from what I'm scared of. Or using a fidget, which we see a lot of people giving kids to do. That'll distract you a little bit from your worry. Well, why do they need to be distracted from their anxiety? What's their anxiety going to do to them if they really focus on it? The problem with safety behaviors is they interfere with that disconfirmation of threat. So first of all, they allow kids to attribute their success to whatever the safety behavior is. Thank God I asked enough people that my talk was going to go okay. Because without that reassurance, it would not have gone okay. Thank goodness I, set my alarm for 6 a.m. 4 days in a row during summer break to prepare for getting up at 6 a.m. when school starts. And I timed myself brushing my teeth and getting dressed. Thank goodness I did that. That's the only reason I wasn't late the first day of school. And it also removes attention from the threat. So there's a really cool study, actually by some University of Texas professors that I know, where they took people into a room with whatever they were afraid of. It could have been a spider, a snake, a rodent. And they said, okay, we're going to do exposure. And just so you know, if you want, there is this like plastic barrier that you can put up between yourself and the animal. So for some of the people, they offered that. And for some of the people, they didn't offer that. Even offering it when people did not use it made the fear reduction go more slowly. Does that make sense? If you know that there's something that you can use to get out of the anxiety-provoking situation, it actually gets in the way of feeling your fear. They didn't even use the plastic barrier, but they knew it was there, and it slowed down the fear reduction. So in session, there are things that we do that we think are good practice that sometimes, not always, but sometimes can be safety behaviors. So like giving kids coping thoughts, like a mantra, like I can do it. Anxiety is not dangerous. I can handle it. That's fine. Those are good things to say to yourself. But if you're repeating those over and over and over, like the whole time you're doing it, like you can do this, you can do this, you can do this, then you're not focusing on the anxiety-provoking situation. And then the new learning is not going to happen. Too much provision of reassurance or distraction. So me saying to a kid while they're doing their exposure, I know you can do it. You're doing great. Keep it up, right? That's distracting them from their fear. I will say those things to them after the exposure is over. But during the exposure, what I'm going to say is, I want you to really focus on how disgusting that rat is. Look at their naked tail, right? I really actually want to bring the fear on. And even your presence can become a safety behavior for some kids. Like if they're doing exposures a lot with you, but not with anyone else, you want to make sure that they do it in other situations with other people so that they're not attributing their success just to being with you. So relaxation, let's talk about it. Relaxation can act as a safety behavior, right? So a couple things that relaxation does. One, it may bring your fear level down before you do the exposure. Remember, the mismatch between what you expect and what actually happens is how you learn. So if you're bringing fear down before the exposure, that's not helpful. Secondly, it can be a distraction because I'm focusing on my deep breathing. I'm focusing on my deep breathing. I'm not paying attention to all the anxious feelings that I'm having. I'm not learning I can tolerate them. And we know that exposure all by itself without relaxation is a very effective treatment for all kinds of psychological disorders and all different kinds of anxiety disorders. It's not made more effective by relaxation. And sometimes it's actually a problem. I think a lot of times people give kids relaxation because we want to give them something helpful. We want to make them feel better quickly. They might feel better while they're with you, having done progressive muscle relaxation, but that is not going to help them with their anxiety disorder. And cognitive restructuring is similar. So I don't know if any of you do cognitive restructuring. Like, let's think about how likely it is that you would, that the elevator will get stuck. Do you know a lot of people where the elevator has gotten stuck? Have you ever been in an elevator that got stuck? We don't want to do that prior to exposure, because if a kid goes into the exposure thinking, I've never known anyone who got stuck in an elevator, and even if you did get stuck in the elevator, it would probably just be for a few minutes, then they're going to have less of that contrast between their expectancy and what actually happens. Does that make sense? So you don't really want to bring their thoughts into more alignment with reality prior to the exposure. I do use cognitive restructuring after the exposure. That's where I'm saying, so what actually happened? What could you tell yourself the next time, right? Okay. Another way to maximize exposure is called deepened extinction or compound extinction. Extinction just means getting rid of the anxiety. So a deepened exposure is when we take multiple situations or items off the fear ladder and we work on them separately and then we bring them together. So for example, I had a kid who had panic disorder, but also a fear of elevators and a fear of heights. And first we worked on her panic by actually having her experience the physical sensations of panic, like breathing through a tiny little straw so she could feel short of breath and learning that it was okay. And I had her take the elevator a whole bunch of times. And then eventually I had her breathe through a straw on an elevator, right? So that's a deepened or compound exposure. Getting a kid hopped up on caffeine so they actually feel anxious, obviously with the parents' permission, obviously like an adolescent, not a 4-year-old. And then going into a crowded mall together after you've actually worked on both of those things separately. You can also pair a new stimuli with a stimuli you've already worked on previously, right? So like I've already done a lot of work with this one little house spider that I have. Now we're going to do exposure with that same little house spider and a different new house spider that looks really different. And actually the thing about deepened extinction is that it actually helps produce relapse, because in real life, a lot of times when you experience one scary thing, you're experiencing multiple of them at the same time. And if you only ever do exposure in these sort of like really pristine conditions, then the first time you experience it outside of those pristine conditions, you might be like, oh, my fear is back, because it's so different from the exposure that I did. So I mentioned earlier that habituation is not everything. We don't care that much about it. So traditionally, in the olden days, when I was trained as a therapist, exposure proceeded predictably from the lowest thing on the hierarchy to the next, only after habituation. And you might decide, like, if I get them down to a 3, that's low enough, or I get them down to a 5, that's low enough, and then I'll move to the next thing. But you would not move on if someone stayed at an 8 or, only went down to a 7 or something like that. What we actually know that jumping around the fear ladder is totally fine, and that habituation does not predict better outcomes. So people who habituate versus people who don't during exposure have similar long-term outcomes. And there might even be some benefits to skipping around the fear ladder, in the sense of really kind of making sure that all those neural networks are being activated and not just some, where then the old ones have more access. I'm not a neuropsychologist. I can't really explain that, but that's what they say. So when you jump around, you actually elicit higher levels of fear, and that can really be helpful in the long term. So one thing I do, because I find that people don't like it when you jump around, it's not fun if I say, hey, we're coming in and we're just going to look at pictures of dogs, but then they come in and I'm like, look, I brought my dog. That's not nice. So I usually will work the hierarchy in order until I feel like the kid is really in a groove, understands exposure, trusts me, is starting to have some confidence in themselves. And then I might start to kind of vary it. Multiple contexts just means you don't want to do all your exposures in the same place, because again, then the first time they experience it outside of your office or outside of their home or whatever, it's like a new experience and it may bring back that fear. So you really want to conduct exposures across lots of different contexts. So, talking to someone at a restaurant, talking to somebody on the phone, talking to somebody at a store, talking to new friends, lots of different places, lots of different scenarios. And this is the favorite one I have, because it makes me feel better about when things go differently than I planned, right? That means occasionally reinforcing expectancies means every now and then the thing they think is going to happen does happen. And you might think, well, that's the end of the world. Now I haven't violated their expectancy. It's actually okay. Sometimes the kid really does throw up. Sometimes they do, go talk to somebody and they kind of get a not nice vibe. Sometimes they do stutter when they're giving a presentation. That's okay. If they never experience reinforcement of their expectancy in your treatment, but then out in the real world, when they're done seeing you, they do, it can actually lead to like relapse. So you actually want occasionally for them to find out it's not the end of the world and you can handle it. And even when the bad thing happens, you are okay. So just so you know, if the feared expectancy happens, it might actually be helpful. It's not necessarily a bad thing. You don't want to do is abandon the exposure and reinforce avoidance. That's the worst thing you can do. Always, of course, praise effort and always trying to work your way back to the planned exposure. Okay.
Do you ever use
about-
sensory deprivation with your exercises?
Can we wait? We're going to have a Q&A in just a minute. So panic disorder is probably something you guys are treating a lot because it's more unusual in kids. It tends to start to emerge in adolescence, not so much in childhood. So there might be teenagers that you see that have panic. Panic disorder is both experiencing panic attacks, which is that sudden onset of physical sensations out of nowhere, all at once, very intense, and also avoiding situations where you think you might have a panic attack, right? So it's not just having panic attacks doesn't give you panic disorder. You get a diagnosis of panic disorder if you have panic attacks and you try to prevent them from happening by avoiding situations where you think you might have one, or you worry constantly about them or are super anxious that you're going to have one, right? So with panic, the thing that the kid is afraid of is their body's own actually harmless bodily sensations. If you've ever had a panic attack, it's really unpleasant, but it's not going to hurt you, right? It's so unpleasant. It does feel, most people when they have panic attacks think they're going to die or think that they are going crazy or think that they're going to pass out or think that they will have a heart attack. All of those things are actually not associated. Like you won't pass out because when you have a panic attack, your heart rate actually goes up. It doesn't drop. There's no connection between panic attacks and heart attacks. You're not going crazy. Lots of people have panic attacks. So they're very unpleasant sensations, but they're actually harmless. But it's going to be hard for a kid to develop a hierarchy considering that all the sensations happen all at once, right? So it's going to be hard for them to say, well, the worst part is when I feel like I can't breathe, but it's not as bad when I feel like my stomach hurts and I'm going to throw up or I feel dizzy or lightheaded, right? All of those things are happening all at once. They can't kind of distinguish them. So what we do is something called an interoceptive assessment to kind of figure out which of the bodily sensations associated with panic are hard for them or scary for them. So that's something that you can do in session. This is what it looks like. So I'm going to have a kid do these different physical kind of tasks that are meant to kind of approximate some of the different feelings that people have when they have panic. And I'm asking them, how anxious did that make you feel? How uncomfortable and how similar to your panic attacks? Because something could be really scary and really uncomfortable, but if they don't experience it during their panic attacks, then we don't need to practice it, right? So jumping jacks for 1 minute, that's getting your heart rate up. Spin in a circle or a chair for 1 minute, that's making you dizzy. Hold your breath for 30 seconds. That's making you feel like you can't breathe. Breathe through a small straw for 30 seconds. If you've ever tried to do that with like a little, those like little drinking stirring straws, those are the thing. You want to pinch your nose and just breathe through that. It does feel like you're drowning. Head between your knees for 1 minute, come up really quickly. There are lots of other different things you can do depending on the sensations that they have. But once I've got this list, so how anxious do you feel? Maybe jumping jacks for 1 minute is like a 2 for them, but spinning is an 8. Now I have a sense of what really bothers them during their panic attacks. And now we can do exposure. Okay. So if feeling dizzy was an 8 for them, the treatment is going to be to spin in a chair and learn that they're okay. And maybe we start with a short spin and then we make it increasingly worse. Maybe eventually they're, spinning and then stopping really suddenly so that, they experience like everything keeps moving, but their body stops. Lightheadedness, maybe they're breathing through a straw for like a little bit of time, a little more time, racing heart, maybe they're running up and down stairs. Eventually they might be doing these things together, right? We might compound it. Okay, someone at the very beginning asked a great question about GAD. Generalized anxiety disorder is very tricky. Okay, so a lot of times it's not associated with avoidance. Kids are worrying, but they're still doing the things that they're supposed to do. It's just they're worrying a lot. They ask for a lot of reassurance. These are the kids who do a lot of polling, checking, rehearsing, planning, but usually not avoiding. And if you try to expose them to all the things that they worry about, it's like playing whack-a-mole, right? Like, okay, we're going to have you turn your homework in late so you can find out that it's not that big a deal. Now they're worried about, can they find a bathroom when they go on a field trip? Now they're worried about whether or not they're going to get asked to a dance, right? It's going to always be changing. So you can really wear yourself out trying to do actual behavioral exposures. So what we do instead is what's called a worry exposure. Okay. Let me go back to this prior slide. A lot of times with GAD, kids have these repeated worries that come into their mind, but they never actually follow the story through. So they worry, they think, oh my God, I'm not gonna be able to find the bathroom at the zoo. But they don't then say, and then what would happen? They don't go all the way through the story. They just keep focusing on the thing that might happen, right? The worry. And that comes over and over in their mind, but they're not really scrutinizing it. And the worry actually is part of the avoidance. The worry is helping them avoid their own kind of feelings of uncertainty, distress, their feelings of the images of the bad thing happening to them. The worry is actually a distraction. So what we do for GAD is called worry exposure, and that is deliberate long-term focus on the worried scenario. And what that does is it actually exposes to them that they're overestimating how bad it would be, underestimating their ability to control it. And I'll show you how we do that. So we select a worried situation. Let's say I actually treated a kid who had generalized anxiety disorder, who had a lot of different worries, but one of them was that his father would not, we lived in New York City at the time, that his father would fail to pick him up from soccer practice. He did soccer practice on like one of the piers in Manhattan, and he lived in Brooklyn. His dad would come pick him up. We had to, take the train home. He had this real worry that his father was not going to be there on time to pick him up. And he worried about that so much. It gave him stomach aches before soccer practice. It made it hard for him to concentrate during soccer. He almost wanted to quit soccer, even though he was actually like an amazing soccer player. He's now a college student. He plays soccer for Princeton. So he's like really good, right? So we selected that as our worried situation. And I had him identify the most feared outcome, which is, we called it abandoned at Pier 5. So that's when his dad never shows up. He's alone at this pier in downtown Manhattan and nobody's coming for him, right? That's the worst scenario. We conjured it up. We made it really vivid. And then I asked him to write a story about it, like a paragraph, all the things that would happen. Dad doesn't come. Everybody leaves. I'm all by myself. I don't have a phone. I don't know what to do. I'm abandoned at Pier 5. I never see my family again. You get the idea. And then I have him focus on just that. Those exact words, that exact thought for 25 minutes as intensively as possible, not thinking about anything else. It's not really possible. So what actually naturally happens during this process is all these more realistic thoughts start to come into his head as he's focusing on the story of abandoned at Pier 5. He starts realizing, my coach wouldn't leave until my dad showed up, right? And other families live in Brooklyn and know my family and would help me out. Some parent would let me use their cell phone, right? All these kind of more realistic thoughts start coming into your mind when you really focus on the worry. Usually, he never really stopped and focused on the worry. He just kept repeating this ruminating thought. I'm going to be, my dad's going to be late. My dad's going to be late. It's going to be awful. It's going to be awful. It's going to be awful, right? So that's what you do. And then only after, thank you, Jordan. Thanks for participating. Only after you've done that 25 minutes of worry exposure do you ask them to tell you about the alternative outcomes that might have come into their mind. So that's what I do for GAD. because you could work all your life trying to whack-a-mole, 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 all the different things that they worry about. But what you really want them to learn is worry is just a possibility. And when you really focus on the thing, the worried scenario, you realize that you probably could handle it if it did happen, or that it's very unlikely. Okay. Questions. I saw a question earlier about what are some of the scenarios I've done flooding for. And so I have done flooding for a lot of different things. I used to work at a clinic called the Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders, CARD. That's an anxiety specialty clinic in Boston. And people would literally fly in from other countries to get treatment there because the guy who owned it was super famous anxiety doctor. And so a lot of times it was things like social phobia. And we would literally spend a day with somebody having them do incredibly embarrassing social interactions. Like, for example, standing in front of the Barnes and Noble and asking people for directions to the Barnes and Noble, right? Things like that. We would start really high, and then, we'd work with them for 2 days in a row. Definitely things like snake phobia, definitely things like claustrophobia are really amenable to flooding. Almost anything can be treated with flooding, but here's the problem. If I do flooding with someone who sees me for 45 minutes once a week, they're not coming back after that first meeting where I make them face the thing they're most terrified of, and they don't have time to really habituate to it. The reason why flooding works when you're doing these intensives is because you know that they're coming back. First of all, they've usually, committed a huge amount of time. You're going to work with them for 6 hours on one day and 6 hours on the next day. So you have all that time to spend with them, where you can really start high and get them to have new learning and get them to habituate. So that was a question that was earlier. Other questions? I know we've covered a lot. We still have a little bit left. I'm going to talk about doing exposure in schools and other settings.
I guess to go back to my former question, and as far as sensory deprivation, do you ever focus on a particular sense like hearing or sight or smell?
Yeah, sensory, I don't quite know what you mean by sensory deprivation, but I will say some kids are very sensitive to things like loud noises or bright lights and things like that. That's physiological, but that doesn't mean you still can't do exposure to it. Because for example, you could learn that, hearing a really loud alarm is very unpleasant, but you actually can tolerate it. So I have done some of that work, but a lot of times when kids have those particular features, they also have other things. Like a lot of times that's kids with developmental disorders, and they probably are getting a different kind of treatment. Anxiety disorder is probably not their primary disorder.
Like wearing a blindfold or earplugs or.
Why would I don't think I would ever do an exposure to a kid wearing a blindfold, because
Well, I just remember some of these exercises from Halloween pranks where you put boiled spaghetti in a bowl and pass along with a blindfold, and it feels like brains or peeled grapes.
You could do exposures to just about anything, but the reason you're doing an exposure is to approximate a situation that a kid is afraid of and avoiding in a way that's impairing for them or enduring with intense anxiety. So unless they're avoiding going anywhere because they have a fear that someone's going to stick their hand in a bowl of spaghetti, I can't imagine that I would do that exact exposure. But if they had a fear of touching something gross, and that was really getting in the way of their ability to go to a birthday party, to be normal in school because they were so scared of touching gross things, we would do exposures to gross things. Okay, other people? Other questions? Okay, well, if you think of one, feel free to put it in the chat. Let's talk a little bit about schools. I think a lot of you Maybe, do you guys know how to raise your hand in Zoom? If you do know how to do that, raise your hand if you are a counselor working in schools primarily, or a social worker, any kind of helper, behavioral health specialist. Okay, I'm seeing hands pop up. So at least some of you are. Okay. So I have done exposure in probably every setting you can really think of. I've done it in schools, I've done it in clinics, I've worked in primary care and integrated behavioral health settings. You can do exposure anywhere. Different settings have different things that make it easier or harder, but you can find a way. So one of the great things about working in schools and trying to do exposures in schools is that schools are literally full of fear cues. Like they're full of social interactions that kids have to have with other friends, with teachers, with adults. You know, you can find almost any kind of social interaction in a school. Performance situations like giving presentations, raising their hands, speaking in class, doing something in gym. There are separation situations for kids who have separation anxiety. There's all kinds of things coming up on the calendar that can provoke anticipatory worry, like quizzes and things like that. And then, of course, there's plenty of germs in schools, right? So schools are actually, in a way, fantastic because there's so many sources of fear in schools. And being in the school versus a clinic has a lot of advantages, right? Because you're there where a lot of times kids are actively avoiding things during the school day or are avoiding school in the cases of school refusal. It gives you an opportunity to practice when it's actually happening rather than just talking about it, planning for it, pretending that it's happening. And you have the opportunity to enlist a lot of other folks who are important to kids' lives, like teachers and peers. Like imagine how easy it would have been for me to do that exposure with Lily. If I was in a school, I just ask 3 teachers to stop by for 5 minutes and have a conversation with her, right? You can also provide a lot of reminders or coaching during the moment. You know, a lot of times I'll work with a kid like, okay, you have a presentation next week. You've been giving it in front of other people. You gave it to me the other day and messed up on purpose to, see how that felt. We gave it in front of a couple people who rolled their eyes and yawned the whole time, and you've been fine. The presentation's on Thursday. I can't wait to hear how it went next week. Well, if you're in the school, you could like stop by and see that kid on Thursday. You've got this. Yeah. And also I think schools have a lot of things like opportunities for reinforcement, right? Like maybe, I've worked with a lot of school counselors where like sometimes in high school, the kids are allowed to leave campus during lunch, or they're allowed to, have other privileges. And if you're in a school, you can use those privileges to actually increase motivation for kids to work on these things. Of course, there are some challenges. So sometimes it's really hard to engage with parents when you work in schools, right? The hours are problematic. You're there when the kids are there and the parents are at work. And we really do want parents to be home coaches. That's super important because usually parents and other family members are accommodating anxiety. And also you have limited time with any kid, even if you're in a school. Like for me, my typical amount of time that I have with a kid is like 40 minutes once a week. And so that's not a lot of time, but their parents are with them a lot more. So if the parents are their home anxiety coaches, that really helps. So I have to say that post-COVID, just being able to have virtual meetings with people has been like a game changer. Because a lot of times, even if a parent can't make it to see me, they can take 15 minutes in their workday to have a Zoom call with me. Sometimes I'll have them join for one, like take off work early one time to come in and do an exposure session with me and a kid so they can just see how it works. And that sets them up to be able to do it at home. And after that, we can just communicate versus with calls or emails or even handouts that I send home with the kid that explain what the practice is for this week. Another challenge is that some fear cues might not be possible in schools. Like if you're working in a school and I keep talking about dog phobias, you're thinking, I can't bring a dog to the school. And that's true. I mean, those kinds of limitations come up in any setting that you're in, right? I mean, if you're working in pediatric primary care and integrated behavioral health, you have all the access in the world to needles if you're treating needle phobics, but you can't very easily bring in a snake, right? So there are a lot of things you can do. YouTube is fantastic. You can work with the parent or teachers to set up exposures that are not going to happen in your session, but are going to happen, right? So I can say to mom, like, do you have any friends who have a real sweet dog? Okay, can you arrange for your kid to be around that real sweet dog? We're working on it. That's going to be exposure number one. You can also use imaginal exposure, role plays, all of those things. And, there are other challenges to exposure absolutely everywhere. And I'm going to be totally honest with you. Exposure requires planning ahead. It does. There's no way around it. You can't just go in and meet the client where they are without having given any thought to kind of the treatment plan and what you are planning to do with them, because exposure, although it is briefer and more effective than just about any other treatment of anxiety, it does require some consideration about how to design and set up exposures. To me, that's okay, because that's like what I expect, and I was trained this way. But if this is new to you, it's going to be a shift. I kind of think about it as like the investment up front that pays off later, because you don't have to see a kid for as long. The duration can be briefer. It also really requires your buy-in. You can't ask a kid to bring on the fear if you believe that being afraid is going to be harmful to them, or you're worried that they just can't handle it. So you have to kind of experience exposure maybe in order to really believe that it is effective. And I think a big challenge, we started off talking about this, is that exposure doesn't always make kids feel good in the moment, right? Other things do, right? If we bring a kid into our office and provide reassurance, they feel better. If we bring a kid in the office and we teach them some breathing techniques, they might feel more relaxed. If we bring a kid in our office and we play Uno, they have fun, right? Those are things that feel nice to us, but ultimately are not going to help them move towards their goals if their goals include having less anxiety and being able to do the things that they value and meeting their goals that anxiety is getting in the way of. So sometimes, it's like they get a little worse to get better. You're making them feel fear so that they feel fear less, or that fear is less of a problem in their lives. So I don't think there's any way to avoid that, unfortunately. But I do find that, I've worked with a ton of kids, and although they at sometimes will say, I don't like doing this, I don't like you, they almost always end up being really grateful for the treatment, because over time they start to learn that they can handle things, that they're braver than they knew. They start to feel really good about themselves. And exposure can be really fun. It really can. All right. So I would love for you guys to take a minute to reflect. I find this is a really helpful thing. We all go to a lot of trainings, and it's like sometimes feels like in one ear, out the other, I'm sure. So think about what's that like main take-home message that you're leaving with today? What's the one thing? If you only get one thing, what's the main thing or things? Think about that for a second. And then what do you want to learn more about? What do you need to learn next to help you use this in your practice? Or maybe you're curious now about treatment of PTSD. Maybe you want to know more about OCD, which we didn't cover in great detail. What are you curious to learn more about? And lastly, what's one concrete thing or step that you could take to learn more? And if emailing me is helpful to any of those goals, please feel free to. You can reach me at my email address there. You can visit my lab website. And that is actually all the content I have. So we have some time for questions. And you can chat them in or unmute yourself, whatever you're more comfortable with. There's a lot of people here, and I haven't heard from some of you, so I'd love to hear from people I haven't already heard from too.
And we also want, Sarah, you could share with me.
Oh, sure. You want to show them where to go for the survey or something?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll stop sharing.
Start sharing.
Oh, hey, Monica, I have a great question here about school refusal, which is
Go for it.
really hard to treat. Do I have time to answer it, or do you want to go ahead?
No, you have more than enough time to.
Okay, Hannah, thank you for asking a great question. So school refusal is tough, man. It involves a lot of systems. I'm not going to lie, it's a lot of work. So yeah, you're not going to be able to treat them by having them come into school, right? A lot of times you're going to have to really work with the parents. So there are a lot of different reasons why kids school refuse. One reason can be anxiety about being in school. That's definitely one thing to investigate. It could be that they have social anxiety. It could be that they have separation anxiety. But another reason why kids sometimes school refuse that has nothing to do with anxiety is because of the things that they have access to when they stay home or don't go to school. And so one of the first things we have to do is make home a less fun place to be when they're not in school. So that's one thing. The other thing is people tend to think, okay, if a kid's not in school for school refusal, we have to start by making them come to school like all day, but maybe just one day a week. Well, coming to school one day a week all day is actually not low on someone's hierarchy. Coming to the school building and standing outside of it, that's low on your hierarchy. Going into like a school-like setting that's not your school, like going to a library and doing work instead of being at home, that's getting closer, right, to being in school. Coming in only to the one period of school that you like, homeroom maybe, and then leaving, that's starting to work on an exposure hierarchy. So a lot of times people get so impatient because, you know, a lot of times maybe even CPS is involved or DPS with school refusal cases that they don't want to take the time to actually help the kid work up through the ladder. But it's really important to take those small steps and be open to those and be creative. Like I've treated school refusal where before the kid came back to school, one of their teachers was willing to meet with them at the library and kind of just get them used to like being even in a learning environment again. And then they went to, you know, just chorus. And then they came back for just the morning. And then they came back for longer. So first of all, it's finding out why they're refusing. Is it social anxiety? Is it separation anxiety? Or is it some kind of secondary gain from staying at home? Like they get to play video games all day or get to be, you know, in bed all day or whatever. I hope that's helpful, but school refusal is tough. There's a great book about school refusal. I wish I could think of who it is by. It will for sure come to me right after this is over. But I could, yeah, if you want to email me, I bet I can find it. Other questions?
Does an environment like girls finishing school or a military school for boys where they like there's certain behaviors that are forced, is that negative in the long term, or is it positive just to force something through like they would do in a military school?
Are we talking about if a kid is anxious about something and then they're having
Yeah,
to do it?
say they're anxious about something and it's in military school for
That
adolescents.
doesn't sound therapeutic to me, right? Forcing someone to do something and potentially punishing them if they don't do it does not sound therapeutic.
Like cognitive,
So
okay.
we're talking about therapeutic exposure here, right? Helping kids learn that the thing that they're afraid of is not as bad. I could imagine in that description, it sounds like it could actually be pretty bad. But, you know, the whole thing about exposure is different from just making people suck it up and do something, right? People do that all the time naturally and don't overcome their fears. You know, people who are scared of flying sometimes get on planes. They might medicate themselves. They might white knuckle their way through it. They're not actually having a corrective learning experience because it's so awful. Jennifer, thank you for this question. I am a hospital social worker and deal with kids with healthcare anxieties. So just being here is exposure therapy. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of like child life specialists and folks that work in hospital settings, I hear this, just even being at the hospital, and they may have experienced medical trauma. Sometimes kids who are chronically ill do. Absolutely. And I do see, so I will say this about relaxation. You've already heard from me, I don't really like it, but I will say the one time where I may use it is if a kid has to be in a terrifying situation right now, and we don't have time to work on exposure because they're in it right now. They're having to have a procedure right now. I will do relaxation with them to help them get through. So I can see why you might use that more. But for example, if a kid is, being discharged and they've developed this fear and you want to help them work on it while they're still around, like if a kid is there for, a longer stay, you can do exposure, right? So like I have seen kids with, needle stick phobias, do a lot of exposures in the hospital, kids who have developed real fears of standard medical procedures that they have to do. Sometimes exposure is really helpful for that. Of course, always in consultation with their physician. All right. That's wonderful, Roseanne. Thank you so much for the compliment. Okay, well, Malachi, do you need to have folks? Yes, Jennifer, I'm going to give MHTTC my slides, and then I don't know how they'll get them to you, but they will. Maybe they'll post them.
Yes, they will. We'll make sure the information that you received today is posted. As I mentioned before, you'll also get follow-up information from us on CEUs. For those of you who participated for CEUs, we thank you again for participating. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Bierman, for this presentation. This has been solid. This is good stuff. And hopefully, everybody cross fingers with me. Hopefully we can get Dr. Bierman back to do some more of the practical pieces of this, but we need your feedback on this in order to make those things happen. So I'm going to post our survey information. Please take that survey. You have access to us on social media, but you can also have access to us in other ways as well. Our QR code is going to pop up. I'm going to send this information to you probably 2 or 3 more times just to kind of get your voice in the process. The only way we can continue to bring these learning experiences to you is to get your voice in the process to make sure that this is value added. And if so, which direction should we go in next? I had a ball. Personally, I've learned a lot. I filled my cup today. I'm good. Hopefully you did as well. Dr. Bierman, once again, we are so appreciative. We've been working real hard to get this going, and now we finally got it off the ground. So I'm appreciative.
Well, I'm so happy to have been here, and I really can't say enough how much I appreciate everyone who stayed on camera, smiled, or, wasn't on camera, but chatted in. And it's just great to have that participation. And I'm super, it's my obsession to help get more effective treatments out there for kids. So I'm really happy to have so many people who share that and are taking steps. So thanks.
Excellent. Thank you all. With that said, if you have any other questions, feel free to direct them into the chat. I'll stick around for a few moments. If not, I bid you adieu. Have a great day. Thank you for participating. Have a wonderful.
Thanks, everybody.